Just a few more days and the old woman won't matter anymore. Those were the words I heard my daughter-in-law whisper at my husband's funeral, and I wish I could say I misunderstood them. I wish I could tell you grief had clouded my hearing, or that my mind was searching for reasons to be afraid. But I heard every word clearly, and what she said next made my blood run cold. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 71 years old, and until 3 months ago, I believed I understood my family. I believed that after 48 years of marriage, I knew who I could trust. I believed that when tragedy arrived at my doorstep, the people closest to me would gather around me, not around what they thought they might inherit. The morning of Arthur's funeral began with a gray sky hanging low over our little town in Ohio, the kind of sky that seemed to understand loss. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror wearing the black dress I'd bought years earlier for an occasion I had hoped would never come. My hands trembled as I fastened a small silver brooch Arthur had given me on our 30th wedding anniversary. The house felt unbearably quiet. For nearly 5 decades, Arthur had filled every room with his presence. His laugh, his voice, the sound of his footsteps crossing the hardwood floors. Now there was only silence. The funeral service was held at a small church a few miles from our home. Friends, neighbors, former coworkers, and distant relatives filled the pews. They spoke kindly about Arthur. They remembered his generosity, his patience, his sense of humor. I smiled when expected. I thanked people for coming. I accepted handshakes and hugs. But inside I felt as though I were standing far away from my own life, watching it happen to someone else. My son Daniel arrived with his wife, Vanessa, shortly before the service began. Vanessa looked flawless. Her dark coat was perfectly tailored. Not a strand of hair seemed out of place. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting condolences as though she were the grieving widow instead of me. Every few minutes she touched my arm gently and asked if I needed anything. To everyone around us she looked devoted, caring, supportive. I almost admired the performance. After the service ended, guests gathered in the fellowship hall for coffee and sandwiches. The room buzzed with quiet conversations and sympathetic smiles. I slipped away for a moment, needing a few seconds alone. Grief can be exhausting when you're surrounded by people. I walked down a side hallway near the church offices and stopped beside a window overlooking the parking lot. That's when I heard Vanessa's voice. She was standing around the corner, unaware that I was nearby. Another woman stood beside her, someone from her side of the family. Vanessa let out a small laugh. Then she lowered her voice. Just a few more days and the old woman won't matter anymore. My stomach tightened instantly. I froze. Every instinct told me to walk away, but I couldn't move. The other woman chuckled softly. "Are you sure everything's settled?" she asked. Vanessa answered without hesitation. "It will be. Daniel's already talking about what we'll do with the house. Once the paperwork starts moving, things will finally be the way they should have been years ago." My pulse pounded in my ears. I pressed myself against the wall, unable to believe what I was hearing. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Vanessa laughed again and said, "Honestly, Arthur's funeral is sad and all, but I'm more interested in seeing how fast the inheritance can be finalized." For a moment, the hallway seemed to tilt beneath me. The woman continued speaking, but I couldn't hear the words anymore. All I could hear was Vanessa's voice repeating itself in my mind. The inheritance. The house. The paperwork. Not Arthur. Not family. Not grief. Just money. Just possessions. Just what she believed would soon belong to her. I stood there silently, staring at the church window as cold fear settled deep inside my chest. Because in that moment, I realized something far worse than losing my husband. I realized that someone in my family had been waiting for this day much longer than I had imagined. I returned to the fellowship hall with the same calm expression I had been wearing all afternoon. No one seemed to notice that something inside me had shifted. The scent of coffee drifted through the room. Paper cups clinked softly against saucers. People gathered in small circles, sharing stories about Arthur, remembering fishing trips, church picnics, and neighborhood barbecues from years ago. I smiled politely whenever someone approached me. I thanked them for their kindness. I listened as they described the man I had loved for nearly half a century. Yet beneath every conversation, Vanessa's words echoed in my mind. A few more days and the old woman will not matter anymore. I watched her from across the room. She stood beside Daniel, one hand resting lightly on his arm. Every few minutes she tilted her head sympathetically and offered comforting words to guests. She looked exactly like the devoted daughter-in-law everyone believed her to be. When our eyes met, she even gave me a warm smile. I smiled back. It was the first lie either of us had told that day. Daniel eventually walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me and squeezed my shoulder. "How are you holding up, Mom?" he asked quietly. I studied his face. He looked tired, sad even. For a moment I wanted to tell him everything I had overheard. I wanted to ask whether he knew what his wife was saying behind closed doors. But grief has a way of teaching patience. Instead, I thanked him for the coffee and said I was managing. He nodded, relieved by the simple answer. Then his gaze drifted toward Vanessa. It happened only for a second, but I noticed it. He looked to her before making any decision, before speaking again, before even deciding whether to stay beside me or return to her. Years ago, Daniel had been independent, confident, the kind of young man who trusted his own judgment. Somewhere along the way that had changed. After the last guests began leaving, I returned home alone. The house greeted me with silence. The funeral flowers lined the dining room table. Sympathy cards were stacked neatly beside them. I set my purse down and stood in the center of the living room. The grandfather clock ticked steadily against the wall. Arthur had wound that clock every Sunday evening for decades. The sound suddenly felt louder than ever. Lowered myself into his favorite recliner and looked around the room. Every object seemed connected to him. The framed photograph from our trip to Maine. The reading lamp beside the couch. The bookshelf he built with his own hands one winter after retirement. For the first time since his passing, I allowed myself to cry. Not dramatic sobs. Just quiet tears sliding down tired cheeks. I missed my husband. I missed the certainty that came with having him beside me. Eventually I wiped my eyes and stood up. There were practical matters to handle. Bills, letters, legal paperwork, the unpleasant details that arrive after loss. As I sorted through a small pile of mail on the kitchen counter, I noticed something unusual. Tucked between sympathy cards was a plain white envelope addressed in Arthur's handwriting. My breath caught instantly. I would have recognized his writing anywhere. The envelope contained only my name, Margaret. No date, no explanation, just my name written in blue ink. My hands trembled as I turned it over. The seal had never been opened. For several seconds I simply stared at it. Arthur had always been organized, careful, deliberate. If he left something behind, there was a reason. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the backyard. The house felt still, waiting. I carried the envelope into the living room and sat down once more. Then I carefully slipped a finger beneath the flap and opened it. At that moment, I had no idea that what Arthur left inside would become the first piece of a puzzle that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Inside the envelope was a single folded sheet of paper. The sight of Arthur's handwriting instantly brought tears back to my eyes. For a moment, I simply held it in my lap, tracing the familiar blue ink with my fingertips. Then I unfolded it carefully. The note was short. Much shorter than I expected. Arthur had never been a man of unnecessary words. Even after 48 years of marriage, he preferred simple honesty over long speeches. The message contained only one sentence. If something feels wrong, call Martin immediately. Beneath it was a phone number I already recognized. Martin Reynolds had been our attorney for more than 20 years. He handled property records, retirement accounts, and estate planning. We trusted him completely. I stared at the note for several seconds. If something feels wrong. The words felt strangely personal, almost as though Arthur had anticipated this exact moment. My eyes drifted toward the dark kitchen beyond the living room. Everything felt different now. Not because I suddenly understood what was happening, but because I realized Arthur might have known something before he died. Something important enough to leave behind a message. Something important enough to make him think I might need help. I folded the note carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. The clock on the wall showed nearly 8 o'clock. It felt too late to call anyone. Besides, I needed time to think. The next morning arrived cold and quiet. Sunlight filtered through the dining room curtains, casting pale stripes across the hardwood floor. I made coffee and sat alone at the kitchen table. Arthur's chair remained empty across from me. I found myself glancing toward it out of habit, expecting him to be there with the newspaper folded beneath one arm. Instead, there was only silence. My phone buzzed shortly after 9 o'clock. "Daniel." I answered immediately. He asked how I was doing. His voice sounded unusually cheerful considering we had buried his father less than 24 hours earlier. At first the conversation felt normal. Then small details began to stand out. He asked whether I had started organizing paperwork. He asked whether I knew where Arthur kept financial documents. He asked whether Martin had contacted me yet. Each question sounded reasonable by itself. Together they felt different. Calculated. Almost rehearsed. I answered politely while revealing as little as possible. By the end of the call, a familiar knot had formed in my stomach. After hanging up, I opened one of the kitchen drawers and pulled out a small notebook. Arthur used to joke that I wrote everything down. Grocery lists, birthdays, home repair estimates, little details everyone else forgot. For the first time in years I began making notes again. Daniel asking about paperwork. Vanessa discussing inheritance at funeral. Martin mentioned in Arthur's note. I stared at the list. 3 observations. 3 puzzle pieces. None of them proved anything. Yet together they created a feeling I could not ignore. Around noon another call arrived. This time the screen displayed a name I had not expected. Martin Reynolds. My heart skipped slightly before I answered. His voice sounded calm and professional as always. He expressed condolences and asked how I was managing. We spoke for several minutes. Then his tone shifted. "Margaret, there is something we need to discuss in person." The seriousness in his voice immediately caught my attention. I asked if it was related to Arthur's estate. There was a brief pause. "Yes," he said. "But I would prefer not to discuss details over the phone. Can you come by my office tomorrow morning?" I looked down at Arthur's note still resting beside my coffee cup. Suddenly it felt less like a message and more like an instruction. I agreed to the meeting. After we hung up, I sat quietly for several minutes. Outside, a light wind stirred the branches of the maple tree in the backyard. The house remained still around me. Yet for the first time since Arthur's passing, I sensed movement beneath the surface. Invisible pieces shifting into place. Whatever Arthur had discovered before his death, I was beginning to believe it was connected to the fear that had settled in my chest the moment I overheard Vanessa at the funeral. And tomorrow, I intended to find out why my husband had wanted me to call Martin in the first place. The next morning, I arrived at Martin Reynolds' office 10 minutes early. Arthur always believed that being early showed respect, and after nearly 5 decades together, some habits become part of who you are. Martin's office occupied the second floor of a red brick building downtown. The waiting room looked exactly as it had for years. The same leather chairs. The same framed photographs of local landmarks. The same quiet atmosphere that somehow made people lower their voices the moment they stepped inside. When Martin appeared in the doorway, his expression was warm but serious. He shook my hand and guided me into his office. After I settled into a chair across from his desk, he closed the door and sat down. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he folded his hands together and looked directly at me. "Margaret, before we discuss anything else, I need to ask a question. Has anything happened since Arthur passed away that has made you uncomfortable?" The question immediately caught my attention. I thought about Vanessa's conversation at the funeral. I thought about Daniel's sudden interest in financial documents. I thought about the note Arthur had left behind. Slowly I nodded. Martin listened carefully as I described what I had overheard. He did not interrupt. He did not seem surprised. When I finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair and released a quiet breath. "I was afraid of that," he said. My stomach tightened. "Afraid of what?" I asked. Martin opened a folder that had been sitting on his desk. It was thick, filled with documents, notes, and printed records. He slid it toward himself but did not open it yet. During the last year of his life, Arthur became concerned about several financial matters, he explained. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, but enough unusual activity that he asked me to help him review certain records. I felt my pulse quicken. Arthur had never mentioned any of this. What kind of activity? I asked. Martin paused before answering. Primarily discussions about future assets. Ownership transfers. Questions being asked before they should have been asked. The room suddenly felt smaller. By whom? I said quietly. Martin chose his next words carefully. Your son and daughter-in-law were very interested in estate matters long before Arthur became seriously ill. I stared at him in disbelief. Daniel had always been practical about finances, but this sounded different. More deliberate. More personal. Martin finally opened the folder. Inside were copies of emails, meeting notes, and records of conversations. He showed me one page after another. Nothing proved malicious intent. Yet a pattern emerged. Questions about the house. Questions about investment accounts. Questions about timelines. Questions about inheritance. All asked months before Arthur's health began to decline. My chest felt heavy as I reviewed the documents. The pieces were beginning to connect. Vanessa's words at the funeral. Daniel's recent behavior. Arthur's warning. None of it existed in isolation anymore. Martin watched me quietly. Arthur noticed the pattern too, he said. That is why he asked me to prepare additional protections. I looked up immediately. Protections. A faint smile touched Martin's face. Arthur loved you very much, Margaret. More importantly, he trusted his instincts. He wanted to make sure you would always be secure, regardless of what happened after he was gone. The emotion I had been holding back all morning suddenly rose in my throat. Even now, Arthur was still trying to protect me. Even now, he had been thinking ahead. Martin closed the folder and rested one hand on top of it. There are details we will discuss later, he said. But for now, I need you to do something important. What is that? I asked. His answer came immediately. Do not tell anyone about this meeting. Not Daniel. Not Vanessa. Let them believe everything is proceeding exactly as they expect. I sat silently for several seconds. Then I thought about Vanessa smiling at mourners while privately discussing inheritance. I thought about the confidence in her voice, the certainty, the impatience. For the first time since Arthur's funeral, I felt something other than grief. It was not anger. It was clarity. I nodded slowly. All right, I said. I will wait. Martin returned the nod. Good, he replied. Because sometimes the truth reveals itself most clearly when people think nobody is watching. When I left Martin's office, I did not drive home immediately. Instead, I parked beside a small lake on the edge of town and sat quietly behind the steering wheel. The water was calm. A few ducks drifted across the surface. Ordinary people walked along the shoreline carrying coffee cups and talking about ordinary things. For them, it was just another Tuesday. For me, it felt as though an invisible curtain had been pulled back, revealing a version of my family I had never fully seen before. Yet the more I thought about it, the more I realized the signs had been there for years. I simply had not wanted to see them. Arthur used to say that love makes people generous, but it can also make them blind. At the time, I always laughed when he said it. Now those words echoed in my mind. By the time I returned home, I had made a decision. I would follow Martin's advice exactly. I would say nothing. I would argue with no one. Most importantly, I would watch. That evening, Daniel and Vanessa came over unexpectedly. Vanessa arrived carrying a casserole dish and a sympathetic smile. Daniel carried a bouquet of flowers. To anyone looking from the outside, they appeared thoughtful and caring. I invited them inside. We sat around the kitchen table, the same table where Arthur and I had shared thousands of meals together. Vanessa spoke gently about grief support groups. Daniel asked whether I was sleeping well. Their concern sounded convincing. But once you hear the truth, it becomes difficult to ignore the performance surrounding it. As the conversation continued, small details began to stand out. Vanessa asked whether I planned to stay in the house long term. She phrased it carefully, presenting it as concern for my comfort. Daniel mentioned how difficult large homes could be for older people to maintain. Vanessa nodded in agreement. Then she casually remarked that the housing market was strong right now. I stirred my tea and said very little. They continued talking. The more I listened, the clearer the pattern became. Every road seemed to lead back to the same destination. The house. The property. The future value of assets. Not once did either of them mention preserving Arthur's legacy. Not once did they ask what I wanted. Several days passed. I settled into a routine of quiet observation. Every phone call, every visit, every conversation found its way into the notebook I had started keeping. The list grew longer. Questions about insurance policies. Questions about account access. Questions about timelines for estate matters. None of it was inappropriate by itself. Together it painted a picture I could no longer dismiss. Then, on Friday afternoon, something happened that caught my attention immediately. Vanessa called and invited me to lunch. In all the years I had known her, she had rarely suggested spending time alone together. Her sudden enthusiasm felt unusual. I agreed anyway. The restaurant she chose overlooked the river downtown. During the meal she was especially warm and attentive. She complimented my appearance, asked about my hobbies, even laughed at stories she had heard before. It was almost impressive. Then midway through lunch she leaned forward slightly. "Margaret," she said softly, "have you thought about simplifying things a little? Maybe downsizing? Starting fresh?" There it was again. Different words. Same destination. I smiled politely and took a sip of iced tea. "Actually," I replied, "I have been thinking about making some changes." The excitement that flashed across her face lasted less than a second, but I caught it. And in that brief moment, I realized something important. Vanessa believed she was guiding the conversation. She believed she was leading me exactly where she wanted me to go. What she did not realize was that for the first time, I was paying attention to every step she took. For the next several days, I decided to give Vanessa exactly what she seemed to want. Not control. Not money. Something far more dangerous. Confidence. People reveal themselves when they believe they have already won. On Sunday afternoon, Daniel and Vanessa came over for dinner. I cooked one of Arthur's favorite meals, roasted chicken with potatoes and green beans. The dining room felt strange without him, but I forced myself to focus on the present. Throughout the meal, Vanessa remained unusually cheerful. She complimented the house several times. She admired the backyard. She even mentioned how beautiful the neighborhood was during spring. Every observation sounded innocent. Every observation pointed toward the same subject. After dessert, I finally gave them a small gift. "I have been thinking seriously about making changes," I said quietly. Both of them looked up immediately. "What kind of changes?" Daniel asked. I stirred my coffee slowly. "This house is large for one person. Maybe too large." The reaction was subtle, but impossible to miss. Vanessa lowered her eyes for a moment, hiding what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with her before looking back at me. "We only want what is best for you, Mom," he said. The sentence sounded practiced. I nodded. "I know." Then I added something I had planned carefully. "I have even considered speaking with a real estate agent." Vanessa nearly dropped her spoon. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. The excitement flashed across her face like sunlight through a crack in a curtain. "That might be a wonderful idea," she said. "A fresh start can be healthy after a loss." A fresh start. The phrase lingered in my mind long after they left. The following morning I called Martin. He listened quietly while I described the conversation. When I finished, he chuckled softly. "They are moving faster than I expected," he said. "That means they are becoming impatient." Later that week, another interesting development occurred. Vanessa began calling almost every day. Sometimes she asked whether I needed help organizing paperwork. Other times she offered to assist with household tasks. Once she even volunteered to help me sort through Arthur's personal belongings. That offer struck me particularly hard. Arthur had been gone only a short time, yet she seemed eager to move every piece of his life into a box. I declined politely. Meanwhile, my notebook continued growing. Dates, comments, questions, patterns. One afternoon, while reviewing my notes, I noticed something curious. Nearly every conversation eventually returned to timing. Not whether I was healing. Not whether I was lonely. Timing. When would documents be finalized? When would decisions be made? When would accounts transfer? When would the future begin? The future they were waiting for seemed remarkably dependent on my absence from the decision-making process. Then came the moment that convinced me I was on the right path. Vanessa invited me to her house for coffee. During the visit, she casually showed me several home renovation photographs on her tablet. New kitchens, expanded living rooms, luxury bathrooms. She laughed and explained that she enjoyed collecting design ideas. Then she stopped on one image and smiled. "This would look beautiful in a house like yours," she said. "Not if you buy a house like mine. Not if someone owns a house like mine. Yours." The word hung between us. I smiled warmly and complimented the design. Inside, however, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Vanessa was no longer imagining possibilities. She was imagining ownership. As I drove home that evening, I realized something important. They believed they were preparing for a future they already controlled. What neither of them understood was that Arthur had been preparing too. And unlike them, he had left his plans in the hands of someone who knew exactly how to keep a promise. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued playing the role everyone expected. I smiled. I listened. I thanked people for their concern. Meanwhile, Daniel and Vanessa grew increasingly comfortable. Confidence has a way of making people careless. The more certain they became about the future, the less effort they made to hide their expectations. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel stopped by alone. First, the visit felt almost normal. We sat on the back porch drinking iced tea while a warm breeze moved through the trees. For a few minutes we talked about ordinary things. The weather, local news, a neighbor who had recently retired. Then the conversation shifted. It always seemed to shift eventually. Daniel stared out across the backyard before speaking. "Dad always loved this property," he said. I nodded. He did. Daniel smiled faintly. "It has become worth a lot over the years." There was nothing unusual about the observation, yet something in his tone caught my attention. I waited. "Have you thought any more about selling?" he asked. I looked at him carefully. "Perhaps," I replied. "Why do you ask?" He hesitated for a moment. "Just trying to help you plan ahead." I could almost hear Vanessa's influence in the phrasing. Help you plan ahead. Concern disguised as guidance. Advice disguised as pressure. The conversation continued for another half hour. But by the time Daniel left, I noticed something troubling. He never once mentioned missing his father. Not once. Instead, nearly every topic circled back to practical matters. Assets, property, future arrangements. The following Tuesday, Martin called. His voice carried a note of satisfaction I had not heard before. "I think you should come by tomorrow morning," he said. "There is something I want you to see." The next day, I arrived at his office shortly after 9. He greeted me warmly and placed a thin folder on the desk. Unlike the thick file he had shown me earlier, this one contained only a few pages. Yet those pages changed everything. Martin opened the folder and slid the first document toward me. It was a record of correspondence dating back nearly 8 months before Arthur's death. Several entries involved requests for information, questions about trust arrangements, questions about ownership structures, questions about inheritance procedures. I recognized some of the names immediately. Daniel, Vanessa. My hands tightened around the edge of the chair. "Arthur saw these?" I asked quietly. Martin nodded. "Every one of them." A heavy silence settled between us. Suddenly memories began resurfacing. Small moments I had dismissed at the time. Vanessa asking unusual questions during holiday dinners. Daniel bringing up financial topics for no apparent reason. Conversations that seemed harmless until viewed together. Martin pointed toward another document. "There is more." I lowered my eyes and continued reading. What I discovered was not dramatic. There were no shocking confessions. No secret recordings. No scandal. The truth was quieter than that, which somehow made it worse. The records revealed a consistent pattern of curiosity about what would happen after Arthur was gone. Not if. After. Long before anyone knew how much time Arthur had left, certain people were already looking beyond him. Beyond his life. Beyond his presence in the family. I sat back slowly. For the first time I fully understood why Arthur had left that note. He had seen the same pattern. He had recognized the same growing impatience. And he had chosen not to confront it directly. Instead he had prepared. Martin closed the folder and folded his hands. There is one final meeting scheduled for next week, he said. That is when the remaining estate matters will be reviewed. My heartbeat quickened. Will everyone be there? I asked. Yes, Martin replied. And I suspect some people are expecting a very different outcome than the one they are about to receive. As I left the office that afternoon, I felt strangely calm. The uncertainty that had haunted me since the funeral was beginning to fade. In its place stood something stronger. Understanding. The pieces of the puzzle were nearly complete. And for the first time, I had the feeling that Arthur's final plan was about to reveal itself. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning. I arrived a few minutes early and sat quietly in the conference room beside Martin. Sunlight filtered through the large windows overlooking downtown. The polished wooden table reflected the light, giving the room an almost peaceful appearance. It felt strange that so much tension could exist beneath such calm surroundings. A few minutes later, Daniel and Vanessa arrived together. Vanessa carried herself with the same confidence I had seen growing over the past several weeks. She greeted me warmly and asked how I was feeling. I thanked her and said I was doing fine. Then we all took our seats. For a while, the meeting followed a predictable path. Martin reviewed standard legal information. He discussed timelines, administrative procedures, and estate responsibilities. Daniel listened carefully. Vanessa remained composed, occasionally nodding as though everything was unfolding exactly as expected. The more relaxed they became, the more certain I felt that Arthur had anticipated this moment. Finally, Martin opened a separate folder. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Even Daniel seemed to notice. Martin adjusted his glasses and looked around the table. Before we continue, he said, there are additional instructions left by Arthur Collins that must be reviewed. Vanessa straightened slightly in her chair. Daniel leaned forward. Neither of them spoke. Martin began reading. Arthur's words were formal, but unmistakably his. He wrote about family, responsibility, trust. He described the importance of protecting the people we love, especially during moments of grief and uncertainty. Listening to his words felt like hearing his voice again. For a moment, I forgot about the paperwork and simply missed my husband. Then Martin turned the page. In addition to my existing estate plan, he continued, I have established protective provisions regarding all major assets, including the residence, investment accounts, and family property holdings. I noticed Vanessa's smile fade slightly. Martin continued reading. Arthur had placed the majority of his assets into a structure that guaranteed my long-term security. No major property could be sold, transferred, or altered without my direct authorization. The family home would remain under my control. Certain investment distributions would occur only according to conditions Arthur had personally specified. Every paragraph seemed to remove another assumption someone had made about the future. Daniel's expression slowly changed from confidence to confusion. Vanessa remained perfectly still. Martin calmly continued. Then came the final section. The section Arthur had apparently spent months preparing. These arrangements were created intentionally to ensure that Margaret Collins remains fully protected and financially independent for the remainder of her life. The room fell silent. No one interrupted. No one moved. Martin finished reading and closed the folder. For several seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of the building's air conditioning system. Daniel finally spoke. I did not realize Dad had done all of this. His voice sounded genuinely surprised. Martin nodded. Very few people did. Vanessa managed a polite smile, but something had changed behind her eyes. The certainty was gone. The confidence that had surrounded her for weeks seemed to disappear all at once. For the first time since Arthur's funeral, she looked unsure of herself. I sat quietly and folded my hands in my lap. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel angry. Mostly I felt grateful. Arthur had seen further ahead than any of us. While others were making assumptions about what would happen after he was gone, he had been building protections designed to outlast him. The meeting continued for another hour, but the outcome had already been decided. By the time we stood to leave, the future looked very different from the one Daniel and Vanessa had expected. And as I walked toward the elevator beside Martin, I realized that Arthur's final act had never been about money. It had been about making sure that no one could mistake kindness for weakness ever again. The weeks that followed felt different. Not because my grief had disappeared. Grief does not leave on a schedule. It arrives unexpectedly, in quiet rooms and familiar places. Sometimes I would walk past Arthur's workshop and instinctively glance toward the door, expecting to see him standing there with a tape measure in one hand and a smile on his face. Other times I would reach for the telephone, thinking of something I wanted to tell him, only to remember he was gone. Yet alongside the sadness, something else had begun to grow. Peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting. The kind that comes from finally seeing the truth clearly. Daniel called several days after the meeting. His voice sounded hesitant. For the first time in a long while, he seemed unsure of himself. We spoke for nearly an hour. There were long pauses between sentences. Moments where neither of us knew exactly what to say. Eventually he apologized for becoming so focused on practical matters after Arthur's passing. He did not mention Vanessa. He did not mention inheritance. But I understood what he was trying to say. Sometimes people become so busy looking toward the future that they stop appreciating what they still have in the present. I accepted his apology, not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because carrying bitterness would not bring Arthur back. Healing requires honesty, and honesty had finally entered the conversation. Vanessa, on the other hand, became noticeably quieter. The frequent phone calls stopped. The invitations became less common. The cheerful suggestions about selling the house disappeared entirely. I did not confront her. There was no need. Some lessons teach themselves. The following month, Martin invited me to his office. One final time. We reviewed the remaining documents and completed a few administrative details. Before I left, he handed me a sealed envelope. Arthur asked me to give you this once everything was settled, he said. My heart tightened as I accepted it. Later that evening, I sat alone in the living room and opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter. Arthur's handwriting filled both pages. I read every word slowly. He wrote about our life together, about our first apartment, about raising Daniel, about the countless ordinary moments that had become precious memories over the years. Then he wrote something that brought tears to my eyes. If you are reading this, then I am gone. But do not spend your remaining years looking backward. You have always been stronger than you realize. Protect your peace. Trust your instincts. And remember that kindness is one of your greatest strengths, but only when it is paired with wisdom. I folded the letter and held it against my chest for a long time. Outside, the sun was setting beyond the trees. Golden light filled the room Arthur and I had shared for decades. In that moment, I understood what he had truly left behind. Not property. Not investments. Not legal protections. He had left clarity. He had given me the opportunity to see people as they really were, and to move forward without illusions. A few months later, I planted new flowers along the front walkway. Neighbors stopped by to chat. Friends invited me to lunch. Life slowly expanded again. Different than before, but still meaningful. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch watching the wind move through the maple trees, I found myself smiling. The same trees Arthur had planted years earlier continued growing long after he was gone. Their roots ran deep. So did the lessons he left behind. Looking back, I realized the most important thing that happened was not what I overheard that day. It was what I learned afterward. People eventually reveal what matters most to them. Some reveal loyalty. Some reveal love. Some reveal ambition. And some reveal greed. The truth always finds a way to surface. As for me, I remained exactly where Arthur wanted me to be. In my home. At peace. Surrounded by memories that belonged to no one else. The day we buried my husband, I thought I had lost my future. What I discovered instead was the strength to protect it.